Hi there, I'm a historian. If you're having trouble sleeping tonight, I think my story might just help you drift off. For now, all you need to do is close your eyes. And if you have headphones nearby, go ahead and put them on. Let my voice and the sound of rain carry you gently into sleep. Now, then let's begin. In the modern world, food is everywhere labeled refrigerated, certified, sanitized. We complain when fruit is slightly bruised. We throw out leftovers after 2 days. But hundreds of years ago, food wasn't a choice. It was a gamble. To eat in the Middle Ages was to risk your health with every bite. Imagine living in a time without fridges, without running water, without even the concept of bacteria, where no one had ever heard the words expiration date, where cooking was guesswork and preservation was superstition, where the food on your plate could nourish you or slowly poison you. Let's step back. Say 700 years to a small village in rural Europe. It's muddy, always muddy. You live in a one-room hut with your family, and the fire pit in the center barely keeps the cold out. Most of your day is spent farming someone else's land, and when you finally come home, exhausted and aching, there's just one thing on your mind: food. But food in your world is not guaranteed. You don't have a pantry. You have what's left from the last harvest, and what hasn't spoiled yet. There's a loaf of bread dense and dark with a crust like stone. It's been sitting for over a week, but it's still edible barely. There might be some cheese, dry and cracked, maybe a salted fish if you're lucky, and meat. That's rare. So rare, in fact, that when a pig is slaughtered in the village, every part is used, even the parts that today we'd never dare to touch. Organs, fat bones, skin. Nothing is wasted. Nothing can be. But here's the catch: even when you have food, you're never really sure if it's safe. People in the Middle Ages didn't understand food safety the way we do. They didn't know about bacteria or toxins or mold spores. They didn't know that what they were eating could be silently killing them. In fact, many of the most common meals of the era were quietly deadly. Take bread, for example. Bread was the cornerstone of every diet, rich or poor. But in damp climates, rye, a common grain, was vulnerable to a fungus called ergot. Ergot wasn't just a little bit moldy. It was toxic. It caused convulsions, hallucinations, vomiting, and even death. People who ate it would writhe on the floor, screaming about visions of demons and fire. In one town, so many people were affected that villagers believed the devil had come to possess them. But in truth, it was just bad bread. Still, they kept eating it. Because what choice did they have? Even something as basic as salt, used to preserve meat and fish, could be dangerous. Salt was often impure, mixed with minerals, or stored in damp barrels that bred bacteria. And if the salt didn't kill you, the meat might. Especially if it had been preserved too long, or hung too close to smoke, or simply left in the sun too long before drying. And all of this is just the beginning. In the world of medieval cuisine, danger wasn't the exception. It was the default. So tonight, as you lie in bed and listen to this strange, forgotten world, remember that the next time someone complains about leftovers, you might want to tell them about the peasants who ate moldy rye and thanked God for it. Now in the next part, we'll travel deeper into the medieval kitchen, where spoiled meat was disguised with spice, where fancy feasts masked fatal flaws, and where the most elegant dish could become your last. But for now, just breathe. You're safe, warm, and far away from the 1300s. We left off in a dimly lit medieval kitchen, surrounded by bread that could poison your brain and salt that might dry your insides to dust. But that was just the surface. Now let's step closer to the hearth. There, hanging above the coals, is something far more tempting and far more dangerous: meat. In the medieval world, meat wasn't dinner. It was a treasure, a luxury. a rare event. And when it appeared, no one questioned its quality. No one sniffed or checked the color. They just ate. But meat goes bad quickly, and medieval people didn't have the luxury of tossing it when it started to spoil. There was no waste, no best by dates. Just a simple rule: if it didn't smell like death yet, it was probably fine. That's where spices came in. Contrary to what we often believe, medieval cooks didn't use spices to make food taste better. They used them to cover the taste of rot. Pepper, vinegar, garlic, mustard. These weren't seasonings. They were masks, disguises, a desperate attempt to fool the tongue into believing that what it was chewing wasn't days, sometimes weeks past its prime. In royal courts, the rich had access to exotic spices from across the world: saffron, cloves, nutmeg. Dishes were so heavily seasoned, they were almost unrecognizable. A chicken that had been sitting unrefrigerated for 3 days. Smother it in wine cinnamon and a handful of crushed almonds. No one would notice. At least, not until the fever started. Food poisoning didn't come with warning labels. There were no home remedies, no knowledge of salmonella or botulism. When someone doubled over with cramps or began vomiting violently, the village assumed it was a punishment from God, or maybe a curse. And if they died, well, death was just part of life back then. But meat wasn't the only thing hiding secrets. Let's talk about sausages. Yes, sausages. These innocent-looking bundles of minced meat were often made with scraps organs, fat, and whatever else could be ground into the casing. But when stored improperly, and they usually were, they became a perfect breeding ground for Clostridium botulinum, a bacteria that produces one of the deadliest toxins on Earth. Botulinum toxin. This was long before refrigeration, airtight storage, or even a basic understanding of microbial life. People didn't know that a sausage could kill them, that it could paralyze the lungs, stop the heart, and do it all silently. To them, the sausage was delicious until it wasn't. And then there was the meat pie. A medieval meat pie wasn't the warm, flaky comfort food you might imagine. It was a gamble wrapped in dough. Meat pies were often made days or even weeks in advance. The crust, known as a coffin, was thick and hard, designed not to be eaten, but to preserve the meat inside. Sounds clever, except they weren't sealed. Flies could crawl in, bacteria could flourish, and the meat encased in darkness and flour would fester in silence. By the time someone carved it open at a feast, the smell was often ignored in favor of politeness. To complain was to insult the cook, and perhaps the Lord hosting the meal. So they ate, and prayed, and hoped their body was strong enough to survive. The truth is, food in the Middle Ages was often a negotiation with death, a bargain struck between survival and sickness. They didn't eat because they wanted to. They ate because they had to. Because hunger was constant. Because famine was always one season away. But somehow, through faith habit and maybe a little luck, they survived just enough to pass these meals and their risks to the next generation. In the next part, we'll move away from the hearth and towards something we all take for granted today: water. Because in medieval times, drinking a glass of water wasn't refreshing. It was terrifying. But for now, just breathe. You don't have to smell the meat pie. You don't have to chew through salt-cured fish. You're safe, warm, and very far away from the dinner tables of the 14th century. We've talked about meat gone bad and bread that could send you into madness. But there's another danger on the medieval table, one that flowed in cups, looked clean, and seemed harmless. Water. To us, water is simple. We pour it from a faucet, crystal clear, clean, and safe. But in the Middle Ages, water was more mystery than medicine. It looked innocent, but it was often the most dangerous thing you could drink. There was no filtration, no chlorine, no understanding of bacteria. Rivers were used to dump waste, both human and animal. Wells were shallow and easily contaminated. Rainwater was stored in barrels filled with leaves and insects. And yet, people still drank it because they had to. Or they didn't. Because most people in medieval towns and villages avoided drinking water whenever possible. Why? Because they had learned the hard way that clean-looking water often brought sickness. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid. These weren't just illnesses. They were death sentences. If you were lucky, you might survive a few days of cramps and dehydration. But more often, you simply faded away, your body too weak to recover, and no one knowing exactly why. So instead of water, people turned to something else, beer. Not the strong, frothy ales we imagine today, but a weaker, watered-down version called small beer. It had just enough alcohol to kill off some bacteria, and it was safer than the village well. Children drank it. Monks brewed it. Entire communities lived on it. In fact, in some places, it was considered more essential than water itself. Wine, too, was commonly used, especially among the wealthier classes. But wine wasn't always clean either. It was often sour thick and mixed with herbs or honey to hide its flaws. Still, it was preferable to the unknown dangers of a cup of cold water. In monasteries, monks developed careful systems for filtering water using cloth sand or charcoal. They were among the few who tried to make water safe. But for the average peasant, these techniques were inaccessible. So beer remained the drink of life. Safer, more reliable, and socially acceptable. But even beer had its risks. Brewing was not an exact science. Sometimes the grains used were already moldy. Sometimes the barrels were unclean. And sometimes brewing mistakes led to the development of toxins instead of alcohol. People would drink, and instead of feeling relaxed, they would fall ill. Once again, the line between nourishment and poison blurred. It's strange to think that something as basic as a drink could be so dangerous. Today, we reach for a glass of water to feel refreshed. But in the Middle Ages, water was feared. It represented the unknown, the unpredictable, the unseen enemy. And so, with every sip, people whispered a silent hope that this cup wouldn't be their last. So tonight, as the rain taps gently against the window, think about that sound. Think about how precious and dangerous water once was. Think about the people who looked at a river parched with thirst and still chose to walk away. Because sometimes the most ordinary things can be the most deadly. Now, in the next part of our journey, we'll explore something else that seems harmless today, but carried a quiet threat in medieval life, the very plates and bowls they used. Because when food didn't kill you, sometimes the dishes did. We've journeyed through spoiled meat, poisonous bread, and the hidden dangers of drinking water. But now, let's turn our eyes to something even more invisible. Not what they ate. Not what they drank, but what they ate and drank from. In the Middle Ages, the dishes on your table could slowly, silently kill you. Today, we take for granted the safety of our utensils. Stainless steel ceramic plates, food-safe plastics, all tested, regulated, and designed with health in mind. But in a medieval household, especially among the well-off, wealth wasn't measured by safety. It was measured by shine. Pewter plates were prized, gleaming, heavy, elegant. But medieval pewter wasn't made with modern standards. It was often mixed with lead. And that lead over time could leach into whatever touched it: wine, stew, porridge, anything with moisture or acidity. Imagine eating hot pottage from a deep pewter bowl. The steam rises, carrying tiny particles of lead with it. Slowly, day by day, meal by meal, your body absorbs it. You don't feel sick, not right away, but the damage builds. Lead poisoning is a cruel patient killer. It attacks the brain, the nerves, the kidneys. It makes your thoughts cloudy, your behavior strange, your body weaker. In children, it stunts growth. In adults, it mimics madness, and no one knew why. When a nobleman began slurring his words when a wealthy lady developed tremors or became confused, it was called bad luck or demonic possession. No one suspected the very cup she drank from. Even wine cups were dangerous, especially for the rich. The sweeter the wine, the more acidic it became, and the more lead it pulled from the metal. Ironically, the upper class who had access to the best food and finest drink were often the most exposed to lead poisoning. The poor who ate from wooden bowls or simple clay were safer, without even knowing it. Then there was glazed pottery. In theory, it was harmless, just hardened earth and water shaped into something useful. But the glaze used to decorate and seal it often contained heavy metals, mercury, lead, arsenic. It made plates shiny. It made bowls beautiful. But it also made them toxic. And unlike spoiled meat or strange-tasting water, a poisoned plate gave no warning. It didn't smell bad. It didn't look dangerous. It was just lovely, functional, deadly. In royal kitchens, servants polished silverware daily, unaware that their hands were coated with invisible threats. In grand banquets, guests toasted with goblets that glittered under candlelight, never guessing that each sip carried a little more poison into their blood. Even storage was a risk. Vinegars and oils were kept in metal jugs, often unlined. Meats hung on iron hooks that rusted. Salt was kept in bins painted with lead-based pigments to make them look fancy. Everything touched something else. Everything leached. And because these changes came slowly over months, over years, no one suspected the truth. The body simply declined. Memory faded. Bones ached. Eyes grew dull. People believed they were aging or cursed or unlucky. No one blamed the bowl. No one blamed the cup. So tonight, as you reach for your own mug, maybe ceramic or glass, safe and tested, think of the families who ate every meal surrounded by silent danger. The children who sipped broth from lead-lined spoons. The mothers who stirred stew in glazed pots that glowed with beauty and poison. In the Middle Ages, food could kill you. But sometimes it didn't have to. Sometimes it was the plate. In our next chapter, we'll look into one of the strangest beliefs surrounding food, the idea that it could be cursed. Because when illness struck without warning, people looked not to science, but to superstition. Was it bad bread or black magic? For now, breathe easy. You are safe. You are here. And your table is clean. In the medieval world, food wasn't just nourishment. It was mystery. It was ritual. And sometimes, it was feared. Because when someone grew ill after eating, when the fever came suddenly, when the skin turned pale, or when the breath became short, people didn't look for mold or bacteria or lead. They looked for curses. In an age before science unexplained, sickness was explained with superstition. And the most terrifying belief of all was this food could be cursed. To us, it may sound strange. But to a medieval mind, it made perfect sense. Food entered your body. It touched your soul. If someone wanted to hurt you quietly, invisibly, without drawing a sword, they could do it through your bread, your wine, your meat. In royal courts, this fear was ever present. Poison was a tool of politics, a whisper in a cup, a sprinkle in a stew. Kings and queens surrounded themselves with food tasters, not for glamour, but for survival. These men would take the first bite, the first sip, knowing they might not take the next. If they lived, the monarch would eat. If not, the meal was over. But not all dangers were real. Some were imagined. People believed that witches could spoil milk with a glare, that they could hex your wheat fields, that they could curse your stew with nothing more than a whisper. In some villages, women were accused of poisoning entire families by simply looking at their bread. Priests were called to bless meals. Salt was sprinkled on food not for flavor, but for protection. Crosses were traced in flour before baking. Herbs were hung above ovens not for taste, but to ward off spirits. At noble feasts, food was sometimes served with prayers murmured under breath. If someone important fell ill after dinner, fingers pointed not to the kitchen, but to the stars, or to the servants, or to the silent girl who had been cleaning the hall. Anyone could be a witch. Anyone could carry a curse. And so the fear grew. In some households, people refused to eat food that had been left uncovered overnight, believing that evil spirits might have touched it. Others would only eat meals prepared by family or watched over constantly. Trust in the cook became a matter of life and death. In times of plague or famine, food became sacred and suspicious. If one family stayed healthy while others grew sick, rumors began. They must be using magic. They must be feeding on cursed grain. Superstition turned to blame. Blame turned to violence. In one town, when a baker's bread was thought to cause madness, he was dragged from his shop and beaten. No one understood ergot, but everyone understood fear. And yet, amid all this suspicion, people still gathered, still cooked, still shared bread. Because even in a world haunted by curses, meals were survival. They brought people together. They offered warmth, comfort, and the illusion just for a moment that everything was okay. So tonight, as you rest and listen, think of the quiet prayers once whispered over soup, the charms once tied to pantry doors, the meals eaten with one eye open not for flavor, but for faith. In the Middle Ages, the danger didn't always come from the food itself. Sometimes it came from what people believed the food could carry. And next we'll step into the grandest halls of all, where feasting was a show of power, but also a hidden battlefield. The medieval banquet, glorious, extravagant, and sometimes fatal. But for now, breathe deeply. No one has cursed your bread. No shadow lurks in your kitchen. You're safe. You're warm. And history is just a story far behind you. Feasting was everything in the Middle Ages. It wasn't just about food, it was about power. A great banquet was a message. It said, I am rich, I am strong, I am untouchable. But even in the glow of candlelight and the sound of lutes playing softly in the background, there was always a quiet fear. Because in these magnificent halls, the line between celebration and death was razor thin. Let's step into one of those banquets. The air is heavy with the scent of roast goose and honey-glazed pork. Long tables groan under the weight of fruit towers, golden pies, and goblets of red wine. Servants scurry back and forth, pouring, slicing, refilling. Laughter echoes. Nobles toast each other with silver cups. At the head of the table, the Lord raises a glass, smiling wide, surrounded by allies and enemies. It's easy to get lost in the pageantry, the color, the music, the excess. But behind it all is a game one built on status, suspicion, and survival. You see, not all guests were truly welcome. Not all hands that prepared the food were loyal. And not all eyes that watched the feast were there for joy. A poisoned cup could change the future of a kingdom. A tainted tart could remove a rival without a trace. So the hosts took precautions. In noble courts, food was inspected before it was served. Certain dishes were prepared only by trusted cooks. Some lords traveled with their own food supply, refusing to eat anything they hadn't brought with them. Others ate only after their food tasters survived the first few bites. In some cases, meals were arranged strategically. Rivals were seated far apart. Dishes were labeled for specific people. Servants were changed frequently, so no one grew too comfortable. And even then, some hosts ate with a knife in one hand and suspicion in the other. Yet despite all this, mistakes still happened. At one banquet in the 15th century, several guests fell ill after eating a meat pie. Only later was it discovered that the cook had reused spoiled venison from a previous feast. The meat had turned, but no one had noticed. Or perhaps someone had. Other times, the danger wasn't poison. It was overindulgence. Feasts could last for hours, sometimes even days. Course after course, plate after plate wine followed wine. It wasn't unusual for guests to vomit between courses just to keep eating. Some even brought their own decorative buckets for the occasion. Doctors of the time warned of banquet sickness, a combination of indigestion, intoxication, and exhaustion. But to decline a dish was to offend the host. So they kept eating and drinking, and many didn't wake up the next morning. Then there were the fires. Large kitchens, open flames, and crowded banquet halls didn't mix well. Tapestries caught, oil spilled. Roast pigs turned into roaring infernos. There are records of entire feast halls going up in flames mid-celebration, and in a world without fire codes or exits, escape wasn't always possible. But perhaps the most haunting part of all is this. Even when the food was perfect, even when the evening ended in smiles and music, no one ever knew for sure if they were safe. Because sometimes poison worked slowly. Sometimes it took days. Sometimes it looked like nothing at all. A noble might return home and fall ill 3 nights later. A servant might vanish before the truth was ever uncovered. And so the fear never left. Even joy in the Middle Ages came with a shadow. So as you lay there, eyes closed, drifting, imagine the flicker of torchlight on stone walls. Imagine the music growing softer, the plates being cleared, the whispers at the end of the table. The feast is over. The danger has passed. Or has it? Next we'll leave the halls of nobility and return to the countryside, where the risks of eating weren't political, but practical. We'll explore the hidden dangers in nature's pantry, poisonous mushrooms, toxic herbs, and deadly mistakes in the fields and forests. But for now, breathe in. Let the sounds of that distant feast fade into silence, and rest easy. The only thing on your table tonight is peace. Not everyone dined in castles. Most people in the Middle Ages lived far from royal banquets, away from gilded halls and silver goblets. They lived in cottages, in villages, in the quiet arms of the countryside, where the threats on their plates didn't come from poisoned wine, but from nature itself. In these rural places, food wasn't just a necessity. It was a daily test of survival, because the forest could feed you or kill you. And without books, maps, or reliable teachers, mistakes were common and often fatal. Let's start with mushrooms. To the untrained eye, a mushroom is a mushroom. Small, round, harmless. But in the medieval forest, one wrong choice could mean convulsions, paralysis, or death. Amanita phalloides. The infamous death cap looks almost identical to several edible mushrooms. Its taste mild, its appearance innocent. But inside it carries a poison so potent that even a single cap can destroy your liver. Peasants didn't have scientific names or field guides. They relied on memory, on passed down wisdom, on the shaky knowledge of neighbors. And sometimes they got it wrong. There are records of entire families perishing after a single mushroom stew, of foragers collapsing in the fields, of healers trying in vain to reverse what couldn't be undone. But mushrooms weren't the only threat. Many wild plants, what we'd call herbs today, had dangerous twins. One root that healed fever might sit beside another that slowed the heart. A leaf that soothed pain might share its shape with a leaf that stopped breath entirely. Hemlock was one of the deadliest. Its feathery green leaves and white flowers seemed harmless, but its sap held neurotoxins that could cause trembling nausea and a quiet, creeping death. It grew freely in ditches, in gardens, even near homes. And yes, people ate it, mistaking it for parsley or wild celery. Foxglove, too, was a beauty with a curse. Its tall purple bells swayed in the breeze, often admired, and sometimes boiled into tea. It could slow a racing heart, but too much, and the heart stopped altogether. Then there was belladonna, the beautiful lady, used in small doses by some to dilate pupils and appear more seductive. But one extra pinch, one poorly measured root, and the body would spiral into hallucinations, seizures, and silence. The problem wasn't just the plants, it was the desperation. In years of bad harvest, when stores ran low and hunger gnawed at bellies, people took chances. They ventured into the woods. They picked what looked edible. They hoped. And often, they paid the price. Mothers brewed teas for sick children, hoping to ease a fever, not knowing the root they used was toxic. Grandfathers mashed leaves into poultices, never realizing the sap was absorbed through the skin. Even the village healer with years of knowledge sometimes got it wrong, because the line between medicine and poison is thin, especially when you're hungry, especially when you're afraid. And it wasn't just wild plants. Even domestic crops could turn deadly. In poorly stored grains, mold developed, not just the kind that tasted bad, but mold that carried aflatoxins, invisible poisons that damaged the liver and weakened the body over time. No one could see it. No one could smell it. But year after year, people grew sick, and no one knew why. So tonight, as you rest, picture that forest. Quiet, peaceful, green. But beneath the leaves, beneath the beauty lay danger. Hidden roots, toxins without color, death in the form of nourishment. For the medieval peasant nature was both pantry and predator. In our next part, we'll turn to the long-term effects of this constant struggle, the diseases that grew from malnutrition, from tainted food, from a lifetime of eating whatever one could find, because there was no choice. But for now, you have a choice. You can breathe deeply, feel the safety of your space, and let the forest fade away. You don't have to forage tonight. You don't have to guess. You just have to sleep. We've wandered through forests full of hidden poisons and seen how a single mushroom or root could bring death within hours. But not every danger in the medieval diet struck so quickly. Some took weeks. Some took years. Some crept in quietly, meal after meal, bite after bite, until the body simply gave up. Because not all deaths came from poison. Some came from starvation dressed as survival. In the Middle Ages, food wasn't balanced. It wasn't varied. It wasn't built on vitamins or nutrients. It was built on what could be grown, what could be stored, and what was left over after the lords took their share. For the average person, the diet was simple. Bread porridge, maybe a bit of cheese, and whatever vegetables were in season. Meat rare, fruit even rarer, and fresh food in winter. Almost unheard of. Over time, this lack of variety came at a cost. Let's begin with scurvy, a disease we now know is caused by a lack of vitamin C. Today, we prevent it with oranges, lemons, even simple vegetables. But in the Middle Ages, when winter came and the gardens died, vitamin C vanished from the plate. The symptoms crept in slowly. Bleeding gums, loosening teeth, joint pain, fatigue, eventually open sores, internal bleeding, death. Sailors weren't the only ones who suffered. Entire villages could be affected by scurvy in late winter when nothing fresh remained, and no one knew why. They blamed the cold, the wind, or God. But the real culprit was the food, or rather the absence of it. Then there was gout, once called the disease of kings. It was caused by diets rich in meat, wine, and fat. While peasants starved, nobles feasted and paid the price. Gout inflames the joints, especially the big toe. It brings sharp, stabbing pain. In advanced cases, it can deform the body, making even walking unbearable. At banquets, men limped proudly, their swollen feet wrapped in silk. Gout was painful, but it was also a symbol proof that you ate well. Proof that you could afford too much. And what about rickets? A disease caused by a lack of vitamin D. It warped the bones of children, leaving legs bowed and spines bent. Without milk, without sunshine, without enough food to grow properly, young bodies weakened. In many towns, these children were seen not as sick, but simply as delicate. Beriberi and pellagra, both caused by vitamin deficiencies, weren't well understood at the time. But their effects were devastating. Weakness, mental confusion, muscle wasting. Entire communities lived with these symptoms, accepting them as part of life, never realizing they were slowly starving, even as they ate. And then there was the constant threat of chronic food poisoning, from lead, from mold, from bad meat. These poisons didn't kill instantly. They lingered. They affected the nerves, the liver, the brain. People would grow more tired, more forgetful. Their hands might shake. Their moods might darken. Some would lose their grip on reality entirely. And still, they would eat the same food, drink from the same cup, because there were no alternatives. By the age of 40, many people looked 70. Their teeth were gone. Their skin was weathered. Their backs were hunched. But it wasn't just time. It was every meal, every winter, every failed harvest. Even childbirth, already dangerous, became deadly in a malnourished body. Mothers didn't have enough iron. Infants were born weak. Milk supplies dried up early. Life expectancy plummeted, not just because of war or plague, but because the body simply broke. And yet, somehow people endured. They planted what they could, stored what they could, passed down recipes and remedies, and in moments of abundance, they celebrated because they knew how rare it was. So tonight, as you rest, think about how far we've come. Think about your kitchen, your fridge, the fruit on your table, the glass of water by your bed. Think about how none of that is guaranteed. And yet, you have it. In the next chapter, we'll return to the nobility, not to their feasts, but to their fear. Because even with the finest food, the richest wines, and the best cooks, medieval elites were haunted by one constant terror: being poisoned at their own table. But for now, breathe easy. Let your mind drift. Let the aches of the past fade like distant memories. You are fed. You are safe. And you are not living in the 14th century. They had gold. They had power. They had the finest wines, the rarest spices, the most skilled cooks in the land. But even kings couldn't escape one creeping fear: that somewhere in their next bite, death was waiting. For nobles and royals in the Middle Ages, poisoning wasn't just a possibility, it was an obsession. Because the higher you climbed, the more enemies you had. Rivals, ambitious heirs, jealous cousins, betrayers hiding in plain sight, and poison. It didn't need a sword. It didn't need an army. Just a touch of powder in a goblet, a few drops in the stew, a tainted fig, a single sip. At court, the table wasn't a place of safety. It was a battlefield. Meals were elaborate rituals of suspicion. Food tasters were employed not for luxury, but for defense. These were usually trusted servants or slaves forced to eat before the monarch did. If they survived the first few minutes, only then would the real guest take their bite. But even tasters weren't foolproof. Some poisons acted slowly. Some were cumulative, dosed in tiny amounts over weeks. And if a king fell ill 2 days after a feast, who would suspect the roast duck? To protect themselves, nobles developed strange habits, some practical, some purely superstitious. They switched cups mid-meal. They refused food prepared outside their private kitchens. They drank only from goblets made of silver, believing the metal would turn black if it touched poison. Some carried amulets. Others wore rings with hidden compartments, holding crushed emeralds thought to neutralize toxins. And cats. Yes, cats were sometimes fed scraps first to see if they would survive. A nobleman's pet wasn't just a companion, it was a front-line tester. Even tableware was weaponized. Forks were rare, considered foreign and suspicious. Knives were common, but closely watched. At some royal feasts, guests weren't allowed to bring their own blades. Instead, shared knives were provided, dull and ceremonial. And still, people died. In Italy, in 1495, Cardinal Giovanni Borgia collapsed at a banquet. Some said it was a stroke. Others whispered of poison administered by his own kin. The truth still debated. In England, King John was rumored to have been poisoned during a feast. Officially, he died of dysentery, but many believed his enemies had slipped something into his cider. In France, Queen Jeanne of Navarre fell suddenly ill after a banquet. Doctors could find no cause. Her enemies smiled quietly. Poison was the perfect crime. No blood, no noise, no witness. And the more power you had, the more likely someone wanted you gone. So rulers lived in a state of constant caution. Some hired personal chefs who lived under strict surveillance. Some installed food preparation rooms within their own chambers, where only the most loyal servants were allowed. In the Byzantine Empire, emperors employed eunuchs as their food guards, believing that those without family were less likely to betray. But even within those walls, no one was ever truly safe, because poison didn't care about rank. It didn't need permission. It just needed a moment, a careless bite, a trusting sip. So as you drift deeper into rest, imagine the great halls of power stone walls, velvet curtains, the clink of silver. A king seated at the head of a long table, lifting his cup, and pausing just for a second. Was it safe? He doesn't know. He drinks anyway. In our next chapter, we'll leave the courts behind and return to the heart of the home, the medieval kitchen itself. We'll explore what cooking looked like in a world without timers, without thermometers, without recipes, and how sometimes the danger began long before the food ever reached the plate. But for now, be still. The cup in your hand is clean. The meal is safe. And history, as always, is behind you. Let's leave the banquet halls now. The royal courts, the long tables and silver goblets. Let's walk somewhere smaller, warmer, closer. Let's step into a medieval kitchen. But don't imagine granite countertops or neat rows of spice jars. This kitchen is dark, smoky, cramped. There's no electricity, no ventilation. Just a fire pit in the center of a stone floor and a ceiling blackened by years of soot. This is where every meal begins. In the Middle Ages, the kitchen wasn't a place of comfort. It was a place of labor and often of danger. Fires burned constantly. Pots were cast iron-heavy, awkward, and blistering hot. Spills could scald. Flames could leap. And ventilation. It didn't exist. Cooks worked in clouds of smoke, their lungs filled with ash, their eyes stinging with heat, and cleanliness. That was a concept still centuries away. Meat sat on wooden slabs, often unwashed between uses. Knives cut through raw flesh, then through herbs, then through bread, without ever being cleaned. Bowls were rinsed in cold water, sometimes shared with laundry or animals. There was no soap, no gloves, no refrigeration. Bacteria thrived here, but no one knew what bacteria was. So meals, even before they were served, were often contaminated. Undercooking was common. Meat was judged by appearance, not temperature. If it looked done, it was done. But pork, poultry, and fish often harbored parasites, tapeworms, roundworms, flukes. Once ingested, they could live inside the body for years, feeding, growing, and sometimes causing death without ever being discovered. And when food spoiled, it wasn't always thrown away. Many believed that bad smells were the danger, not the food itself. So if a piece of meat looked all right, but stank, it might simply be boiled longer, or drowned in vinegar, or covered in spices. Boiling didn't always save it, but it made it more edible, or at least more tolerable. In large households like castles or monasteries, the kitchen was a chaotic place. Dozens of staff worked side by side, some skilled, some barely trained. Communication was poor. Food was mislabeled. Ingredients mixed up. Salt mistaken for sugar. Fat mistaken for cream. In one infamous case, a cook added poisonous berries to a pudding, mistaking them for plums. Half the guests fell ill. 2 never recovered. And then there was the water. Water used for cooking was often drawn from shallow wells or local streams already filled with waste and runoff. When that water boiled, some danger was removed, but not all. And if water was only warmed, not boiled, the bacteria remained. Soups, stews, porridges, staples of the medieval diet were all made in these conditions. Open pots, dirty ladles, unwashed hands. But the food still reached the table. It had to. People were hungry. Work needed to be done, and there was no time to question every step in the process. In monasteries, monks attempted to regulate kitchens more strictly. Clean cloths, limited access. But even there, rules were bent. Corners cut. Food reused. And when someone got sick, it was considered an act of God, not of poor hygiene. In cities, street food was common, but even riskier. Vendors cooked over open fires, serving hot pies and boiled meats to workers and travelers. No licenses, no inspections, no standards. And still, people lined up. Because hunger waits for no one. And when the only choices are food or nothing, people choose food. So tonight, as you lie in your bed, safe and full, imagine that old kitchen. The stone floor, the flicker of fire, the cook's hands rough and blackened with soot. She stirs a pot, unaware that the spoon she holds carries more than just flavor. She doesn't know what salmonella is. She's never heard the word parasite. But her food will be eaten. Because it must. In the next part, we'll explore how even preservation meant to keep food safe sometimes led to disaster. Salting smoking. Fermenting clever ancient techniques. That didn't always work as intended. But for now, rest. Your kitchen is quiet. Your food is clean. And no one is stirring stew by firelight while coughing in smoke. Preservation was everything. In a world without refrigeration, food didn't last. It decayed. It soured, it vanished. And when winter came, or the harvest failed, or roads froze, over people didn't need fresh meals. They needed stockpiles. They needed food that could last. But what was meant to protect could still destroy. In the Middle Ages, food preservation was a delicate balance between survival and sickness. The techniques were ingenious, centuries old, passed down through generations. But they weren't perfect. And when they failed quietly. Let's start with salt. Salt was life. It drew moisture out of meat, preventing rot. It stopped the growth of mold, slowed the spread of decay. People used it to preserve fish pork, even butter. Salted cod, salted beef, salt pork. It filled barrels and cellars across Europe. But salt was also precious taxed, fought over, and often diluted to stretch supplies. In some markets, merchants mixed it with sand chalk or ash. Others reused old brine, unaware that the bacteria had already broken through. And if meat wasn't salted properly, if it was too thick or left too long in the open, it would rot from the inside out. You couldn't always see it or smell it, but it was there. Next came smoking. Smoking meat or fish gave it flavor, drove out insects, and added days or weeks to its life. But in a cramped medieval kitchen with inconsistent heat and no thermometers, the process was unreliable. If the fire burned too low or too fast, the inside of the meat might remain raw, even as the outside looked cured. Worse still, the smoke itself, especially when using damp wood or pitchy resin, left behind chemicals that in high doses were toxic. We know today that excessive smoke exposure can cause cancer. Back then, it simply caused coughing and confusion. Then there was fermentation. Fermentation gave the world cheese, beer, wine, vinegar, pickles, staples of the medieval diet. But without control over temperature, time, or cleanliness, fermentation could easily go wrong. Milk might sour too quickly. Grains might develop mold before turning to alcohol. Barrels used to store beer might hold leftover bacteria, quietly multiplying inside. In one recorded case, a batch of beer in 16th century Germany made an entire village sick. Dozens fell ill. A few died. No one knew why, only that it tasted slightly off. Later studies suggest the grain may have been infected with fusarium, a mold that produces vomiting, diarrhea, and hallucinations. Even cheese, beloved and essential, had risks. Soft cheeses, when made in unclean conditions, could carry listeria or botulism. Hard cheeses, if cracked or exposed to dampness, could grow mold that wasn't always visible. People ate it anyway, because it was food, and food couldn't be wasted. Then there was vinegar, used not only to preserve vegetables, but to clean wounds and rinse meat. But some vinegar was homemade, brewed from spoiled wine. If brewed improperly, it could host bacteria instead of killing it. And let's not forget dried foods, grains, fruits, beans. Stored in sacks, barrels, or clay pots, they seemed safe, until mice, insects, or moisture slipped in. Fungal spores grew silently. Toxins built up over time. Entire families could grow sick from a single bag of rye that had sat too long in a damp corner. Yet people kept preserving. They had to. Because without these methods, there was no winter, no future, no choice. And most of the time, they worked. The food stayed edible. The cellar stayed full. The village survived. But every now and then, something slipped through. And in the Middle Ages, one mistake could echo for weeks. So tonight, as you drift deeper into sleep, think of those stone cellars, the barrels, the smokehouses, the jars lined up along dusty shelves. Think of the hands that prepared them carefully, hopefully, unknowingly. They did their best, but they didn't know what mold was, or bacteria, or toxins hiding in silence. They only knew hunger, and they fought it the only way they could. In the next part, we'll explore how all these risks weren't just threats to health, but to trust. Because in time, food wasn't just food anymore. It became a weapon, and the kitchen a battlefield. But for now, you're far from cellars and salted meat. You're safe, you're fed, and sleep is waiting. Food is meant to nourish, to bring people together, to comfort. But in the Middle Ages, food could also divide, and sometimes it could destroy. Because when danger lurks in every loaf, in every cup, in every spoonful, trust begins to rot. Slowly, quietly, like mold on cheese, like poison in wine. We've spoken of bad meat, of foul water, of cursed bread. But what happens when the true danger isn't in the food, but in the hands that serve it? In medieval villages, families often ate from the same pot. They shared bread, passed bowls, drank from the same jug. Mealtime was communal, sacred. A rare pause in long days of labor. But when someone got sick, when a child began to cough, or an elder collapsed after supper, the questions came quickly. Who cooked this? Where did this come from? And then, who was the last to touch it? In a world without science, blame filled the gaps. A mother might be accused of negligence. A daughter-in-law might be whispered about. A servant might disappear. In noble households, the stakes were higher. A simple stomachache after dinner could spark rumors of betrayal. An untimely death could bring down an entire family line. And so the kitchen became a battlefield. Cooks were monitored. Ingredients were locked. Servants were replaced without warning. A meal was no longer a meal. It was a test of loyalty. There are recorded cases of entire families turning against one another after a shared illness. Husbands suspecting wives. Brothers blaming sisters. Children watching what their parents ate and who gave it to them. Because the fear wasn't just of accidental poisoning. It was of intentional harm, hidden vengeance, secret plots. And the most terrifying part, it worked. Food was the perfect weapon. It left no mark, no scream, no witness, just silence. In 1419, a wealthy merchant in Florence died suddenly after supper. The stew, it was said, tasted slightly bitter. His wife was arrested. She claimed innocence. But her quiet smile unnerved the court. In Germany, a landowner grew paranoid after his two sons fell ill within days of each other. The baker was blamed. He was beaten in public. No evidence was found, but the damage was done. In England, a noblewoman was accused of poisoning her husband with herbs steeped into his wine. The herbs had come from her garden. The servants swore she used them in cooking often, but this time, he never woke up. And in countless towns, unnamed and unrecorded people whispered behind closed doors, "Don't eat that. Not from her. Be careful, he's been acting strange." Suspicion lived in the pantry. It slept beneath the table. It lingered in the steam rising from the pot. Even festivals weren't safe. During public feasts, guards were sometimes posted near kitchens. Wine was sealed with wax. Dishes were sampled by multiple tasters. But still, the whispers never stopped, because everyone knew. If someone wanted you gone, all they had to do was wait until dinner. This fear bred rituals. Some families prayed not just before meals, but over each individual dish. Others kept a test plate set aside offered to animals or servants first. In wealthier homes, a trusted child might be fed first just a bite to see what would happen. Even among friends, people learned to hesitate, to sniff, to watch. So tonight, as you rest, picture that small cottage kitchen. The pot is boiling, the bread is warm, and yet two people at the table are watching each other just a little too closely. Not speaking, not smiling, just wondering. Because sometimes the true poison wasn't in the food, it was in the silence. In our next part, we'll leave the kitchen and walk outside into the fields, the roads, the markets. We'll look at the bigger picture, how starvation, hoarding, and control over food became tools of war punishment and power. But for now, your plate is clean, your hands are warm, your home is quiet, and history can wait until morning. We've spent our time in kitchens, cellars, and banquet halls, watching food spoil, twist, deceive, and sometimes kill. But now, let's step outside. Out into the open, onto the roads, into the markets. Because the danger didn't stop at the plate. Sometimes, it began long before the meal was ever made. In the Middle Ages, food was more than sustenance. It was power, and those who controlled it controlled everything. Harvests ruled the rhythm of life. A good season meant full bellies, warm nights and weddings. A bad season meant fear, hoarding, hunger, and sometimes death. But famine wasn't always natural. It could be manufactured, and it often was. Rulers understood that withholding food could control a people better than any army. If a town rebelled, food routes were cut off. If a village refused to pay taxes, their grain was seized. If a rival family gained too much influence, rumors might be spread about disease in their livestock. Their meat wouldn't sell. Their wealth would shrink. Their people would starve. Even the church-keeper of faith and morality used food as leverage. During periods of penance or punishment, entire regions were placed under interdict, a spiritual sanction that could ban sacraments, weddings, and feasts. Villagers weren't just denied communion, they were denied celebration, joy, community. And with it, sometimes came rationing. Monasteries held great power over grain and land. Their stores could feed a village or let it wither. They decided who received help in times of shortage, who deserved it, and who didn't. In cities, guilds controlled access to flour, meat, salt, and oil. If you angered the wrong official, your stall might be shut, your bread deemed too light, your rights to sell revoked. Without access to food, you weren't just poor, you were powerless. And when war came, as it often did, food was the first casualty. Invading armies burned fields, poisoned wells, stole cattle, not just for strategy, but for cruelty. To crush the will of a people, you didn't have to kill them. Just take their bread. Let hunger do the rest. In sieges, civilians were starved by design. Castles withheld grain from peasants. Commanders let women and children go hungry to save the men. In long conflicts, some towns resorted to eating rats, dogs, even the dead. And still, the lords at the top drank imported wine. Even markets, places of color, sound, and life held danger. Merchants diluted goods. Scales were rigged. Flour was padded with chalk. Spices were stretched with dirt. And if you were poor, you didn't get to choose. You took what you could afford and hoped it wouldn't kill you. So food became not just fuel, but currency, a weapon, a wall. And for many, control over food meant survival in a different way. Those who obeyed got fed. Those who didn't disappeared. But amid the hardship, there was resilience. Families learned to stretch meals. Communities gathered to share soup. Bread was blessed, stored, hidden, even stolen. And sometimes kindness surfaced, a baker giving away the last loaf. A farmer leaving potatoes at a neighbor's door. Quiet rebellions against a cruel system. So tonight, as you rest, think of the hands not just cooking, but rationing, measuring, gatekeeping. Think of the power in a sack of grain, in a wheel of cheese, in a handful of salt. In the next part, we return to the individual, the forgotten worker, the servant, the one in the background of the feast. Because not everyone got a seat at the table, but everyone needed to eat. And sometimes those left with scraps paid the highest price. But for now, your table is yours. Your kitchen is full. And the laws of food are no longer written by kings. Not everyone in the Middle Ages had a table, or a bowl, or even a meal. While kings feared poison and nobles worried about scandal, most people had a simpler concern: was there anything left to eat? Because for the servants, the peasants, the stable boys, and kitchen maids, food wasn't about choice, It was about chance. If the kitchen had extra, they ate. If not, they waited. If something spoiled, they were given that. If something burned, they scraped it into a bowl and called it dinner. And if nothing was left at all, they went to bed hungry. In castles and noble homes, servants were fed last. After the guests. After the lord and lady. After the tasters, the dogs, the musicians, the guards. And what remained was often dangerous. Bones with traces of meat, bits of gristle, soups too thin to nourish, bread gone hard and crusted with mold, cheese with dark edges, fruit with flies. They ate it anyway. They had to. In monasteries, monks took vows of poverty, but even then, hierarchies existed. The older monks ate better. The kitchen brothers who prepared the meals often subsisted on the leftover mash scraped from the bottom of the pot. Cold, overcooked, or undercooked, sometimes spoiled. The same was true in towns. Apprentices in workshops were fed by their masters, but just barely. Beggars relied on handouts from churches. Widows traded scraps, or begged at the doors of bakeries, hoping for the crumbs swept from the floor. And in rural villages, the poor grew what they could, but weather wore and bad luck could strip a garden bare. A single frost, a bad harvest, a sick animal. And suddenly, there was no food at all. Children ate less than adults. Women often ate after men. And the sick, sometimes not at all. This wasn't just hunger. It was structural. Baked into the way life worked. Power decided who ate and who didn't. And when illness came, it came fast. Because spoiled food is hardest on those already weak. Malnourished bodies don't fight back. Thin blood doesn't heal. The stomach, when empty too long, can't handle a sudden meal. There are stories hundreds, thousands of children dying after eating bad porridge. Of maids collapsing after licking the spoon. Of workers fainting in the fields because their last meal was 2 days ago, and it was a crust of bread soaked in water. No poison, no evil, just absence. And sometimes that's the cruelest kind of danger. Because there's no one to blame, no villain, just silence. Still, people tried. They foraged, boiled weeds, ground acorns into flour, traded cloth for eggs, shared what little they had. There were moments of kindness. A tired baker handing a warm roll to a boy with dirt on his face. A widow giving her last turnip to a neighbor. A servant girl slipping an extra spoonful into a child's bowl when no one was looking. Small, quiet acts. That didn't stop the hunger, but made it bearable. So tonight, as you lie in comfort, imagine that kitchen corner. The servant sitting quietly, spoon in hand, waiting to see if anyone leaves leftovers. Watching the last bits scraped from the plate, hoping for one more bite. Because for them, the danger wasn't in what was on the table. It was that there might be nothing at all. In our next part, we'll visit one of the darkest chapters in this story, the famine years. Times when crops failed, prices soared, and entire populations starved, not because there wasn't food, but because they couldn't reach it. But for now, you're full. You're home. And history, once again, is just a story. There are many kinds of hunger. The hunger of a skipped meal. The hunger of a poor season. The hunger of a long day with too little on your plate. And then, there is famine. Not hunger that whispers, but hunger that screams. In the Middle Ages, famine wasn't rare. It was expected. Like winter. Like war. It came in cycles every 10-20 years, sometimes longer, sometimes sooner. But always, eventually, it returned. And when it didn't just take food, it took everything. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 swept across Europe like a slow, cold wind. It began with rain, endless rain. Fields flooded, crops drowned, grain sprouted too early, hay rotted, livestock starved, and then came the cold. And then came silence. Markets emptied. Bread doubled in price, then tripled, then vanished. Horses were slaughtered. Dogs disappeared from alleys. Cats, too. Even rats were hunted. In France, people ate bark. In Ireland, moss. In Germany, straw boiled into soup. In some towns, children were abandoned. In others, eaten. There are reports whispers in the margins of old texts of parents trading their dead, of neighbors watching over pots too closely, of carts collecting not just the sick, but the bones of the missing. And the cruelest part, there was still food, locked in granaries, hidden in noble stores, hoarded by those with power. While the poor begged in the streets, sacks of wheat sat untouched in guarded towers. While babies cried from hunger, the church collected grain as tithe. While women sold their bodies for bread, merchants waited knowing that scarcity would make their fortunes rise. People didn't just die of starvation, they died of despair. And long after the rain stopped, the scars remained. Children born during the famine were smaller, weaker, more prone to illness. Whole generations remembered the taste of boiled leather, of dirt, of nothing. Morality bent under pressure. Thieves weren't just punished, they were hated. Not for stealing gold, but for stealing food. Justice broke. In England, a man who killed a pig was hanged. Another who killed a man for bread was pardoned. Because everyone understood. Hunger doesn't ask for permission. In monasteries, monks rationed what they had. In castles, lords reduced portions not for themselves, but for their servants. The black bread grew darker. The broth grew thinner. And hope for many simply vanished. But even then, people adapted. They shared seeds, hid roots, learned to dry nettles and grind acorns into bitter flour. Women formed secret gardens. Children were taught what weeds could fill the belly, even if just for a while. And when the famine finally ended, when the sun returned and the soil dried, it didn't bring joy. It brought silence. Because those who had survived had watched too many who hadn't. So tonight, as you lie warm, and still remember that not every death was sudden. Not every danger was loud. Some deaths came with a slow fade, a quiet kitchen, an empty bowl. In the next part, we'll begin to shift away from tragedy and toward recovery. Because even after centuries of risk and ruin, humans learned. Slowly, painfully, but they learned. And from the darkest kitchens came sparks of change. But for now, close your eyes. Breathe in, and let the rains of 1315 pass by like a storm you've already weathered. Not all stories of medieval food end in fear. Some end in change. In slow, quiet progress. In the kind of wisdom that comes not from books, but from generations of hardship. After centuries of hunger poisoning mold and mistrust, something began to shift. It didn't happen overnight. There was no grand revolution. But piece by piece, bite by bite, people began to learn, to adapt, to survive better. It started with the land. Farmers noticed which fields grew better barley, which grains lasted longer through the winter. They experimented not with science, but with patience. They rotated crops, let some fields rest, introduced clover to replenish the soil. Small changes, big impact. And then came the tools. Simple plows became stronger, iron-tipped, more efficient. Oxen were replaced with horses. Harnesses improved. What once took a day now took an hour. The harvest grew slowly, surely. Grain was stored more carefully, in raised barns, in sealed containers. Clay pots were glazed better. Wooden barrels were built tighter. Bread was baked in communal ovens, hotter, cleaner, safer. In towns, something remarkable happened. Markets began to flourish. Local trade became regional. Villages didn't have to rely only on their own harvest. They could trade wool for flour, cheese for apples, honey for oil. This meant variety, and variety meant nutrition. The same plate didn't have to be repeated for weeks. Guilds helped too. Bakers' guilds enforced weights and standards. Brewers learned to test batches. Butchers were watched for cleanliness. Was it perfect? No. But it was better. Then came preservation. Salt was still precious, but better refined. Smoking became more consistent. Drying fruits and herbs became common. Fermented foods. Cheese, beer, vinegar were handled with more experience, more care. People knew which barrel might spoil, which cellar stayed too damp. They learned from mistakes. Even kitchens changed. Stone hearths became more efficient. Chimneys carried smoke away, letting cooks breathe. Utensils were cleaned more often. Hands, too. Boiling became safer. Recipes were copied, shared. Simple cookbooks appeared not yet printed, but passed by word of mouth or ink on parchment. And most importantly, people started listening to one another. Old women became village healers, not just for illness, but for food knowledge. They knew which root to avoid, which berry was safe, which herb soothed the gut. The fear of food didn't disappear, but it faded, and slowly life expectancy rose. Children survived more winters. Fewer people died from dinner. A bowl of porridge became comfort, not a gamble. Of course, dangers remained, but something had changed. Knowledge. And knowledge, unlike bread, doesn't spoil. It grows. So tonight, as you lay there listening, know that even the darkest stories eventually bend toward light. That even in centuries of ignorance and pain, there were sparks. Sparks that lit kitchens, markets, minds. In the final part of our journey, we'll bring it all together. Because if food once killed, it also healed. But for now, sleep in peace. The fire has burned low. The bread is warm. And for once in this long story, everything is safe. We've come a long way together. From rotten meat and poisoned bread. From cursed kitchens and silent famines. From whispered fears in candlelit halls. To forgotten hands scraping burnt stew from the bottom of a pot. This wasn't just a story about food. It was a story about survival. Because in the Middle Ages, every meal was a question. Is this safe? Will I live through the night? And yet people still gathered, still broke bread, still fed one another despite the danger, despite the loss. They learned, slowly, painfully, from mistakes, from illness, from death. And what they learned became the foundation of how we eat today. They didn't have laboratories, or labels, or health inspectors. They had trial, error, memory, and faith. And we, centuries later, benefit from their experience. Every clean glass, every safe meal, every warm kitchen is built on their struggle. Today, we live in a world where food has never been safer, where diseases like scurvy are almost unheard of, where boiling water is as easy as pressing a button, where meat is inspected, milk is pasteurized, and bread is baked with precision. And yet, how often do we pause to think about it? How often do we appreciate the simple miracle of a safe meal? It took lifetimes to get here. Generations of mothers hoping the soup wasn't spoiled. Of farmers watching the skies, praying for sun. Of cooks wiping sweat from their brow, stirring carefully, whispering old instructions learned by heart. So tonight, as you lie, still let it all settle in. Let the noise of the feasts fade. Let the smoke from the hearth rise and vanish. Let the hunger pass. You've heard the stories, felt the weight of centuries, tasted the risk even in imagination. And now, it's time to rest. because the kitchen is quiet, the bread is fresh, the water is clean, and the danger is behind you. You made it. Sleep well. Thank you for listening. If this story stayed with you, consider joining me again for the quiet corners of history where we rarely look but always learn. Until then, take care and good night.